Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to learn about market failures. Let's get started. Okay, so the first section here just defines what market failures are. They are a quantity problem, right? So the problem is that we are not at the right quantity. And what we would say is that the failures are going to occur when the quantity is too large or too small, and that will lead to deadweight loss. So this is all something that we've kind of talked about before in a prior class. We talked about allocative efficiency, right? And that's really what we're saying here is that they are not allocative efficient, where price is marginal cost, demand equals supply. Now, the important part that we're going to consider with market failures in general, right? And this is kind of where things are new, is that it's going to be taking into account all of the costs and benefits as well as the internal ones. So normally when we talk about transactions, we're only talking about you buy something, I sell it to you, you are affected, I am affected. But what if a third party or a bunch of third parties are affected by you buying something when I sell it to you? It could be maybe you're affected when I produce it, maybe you're affected, or maybe, sorry, the outside party is affected when I produce it, maybe they are affected when you consume it, but someone else is affected by the fact that you and I are doing this transaction. That's what this part means. Now, failures happen when we aren't producing the quantity that's actually socially optimal for everybody in society. So we actually have to consider what those other people have in terms of their effects from our transaction. Now, as just a quick list in one spot of all the types of market failures that we've learned about, we've talked about monopolies, oligopolies, monopolistic competition, and monopsonies. All four of those are examples of market failures where the market does not produce the socially optimal quantity and price at the socially optimal price that corresponds with it. These two are going to be below: the underproduction of things called public goods and the overconsumption of common resources. They have names. They're called the tragedy of the commons and the free rider problem. We'll get into those in just a second. And then there's externalities, which will actually be the very next lesson. And those are transactions where you have something extra, right? Someone else outside who's being affected by it. So let's talk about these number two and three in terms of market failures. To understanding these two market failures called the free rider problem and the tragedy of the commons, we have to back up a little bit. Economists kind of sort goods in really, they ask two questions about goods and services when they're being produced, and they kind of categorize these goods using these two questions. We could have actually had this conversation in Unit 1, but it really only matters when we're talking about these two types of goods that result in market failures. So the first question is it rivalrous, right? Is it rivalrous? And if it's not, we call it non-rivalrous. If it is, we call it rivalrous. And what that means, right, is that if I consume, you can't. That's all that means, right? So a cheeseburger, if I consume it, you cannot because I ate it. If I get a haircut, while I am getting a haircut, you cannot, right? They can't cut two people's hairs at the same time. At least it takes twice as long. So we would say that a haircut is rivalrous. We would say that a cheeseburger is rivalrous. We would say that this pen is rivalrous, right? Things that are not rivalrous in consumption. This video, when you're watching this video, someone else can watch that video as well. So it's not rivalrous in that sense, right? So there's lots of things that are non-rivalrous goods, and there are things that are rivalrous goods in terms of consumption patterns. Let's talk about the other question, excludable. The excludable means that I can prevent someone, this is actually what it means, can prevent someone from consuming if they didn't, contribute to production. To the production. And I'm saying that kind of in a technical way a little bit, that I can is the excludable and that I can't is not excludable, right? And the important part here is that I could prevent someone from consuming if they didn't contribute to production. Normally we call that paying for it. But I think it's more useful, especially when we start talking about some public goods and common resources, that you can think about, like, am I benefiting from this thing, that I can consume it and be benefiting from it without contributing to it? Right? That's actually the central issue. It's not so much like literally paying for it in a sense of like paying money, but I can actually consume the benefits of it without contributing to its production. That's the central issue actually with excludability. And that's why these two actually kind of matter, especially public goods. So let's kind of sort some good examples of what goods are. Private goods. Private goods the market is really good at. Market is great at doing these for the most part. We would things like cheeseburgers, which is what I gave you as a moment ago. An example is a cheeseburger. We could also say a haircut. is another example of that, right? Because they could exclude you and say you did not contribute to the production of the haircut, therefore you may not have a haircut. You did not contribute to the production of the cheeseburger, therefore you may not have the cheeseburger. And at the same time, if you are consuming it, then no one else can, right? So the market is great at providing those types of goods. Those are called private goods. The market is also great at these, is great. And I say great, but with the extension that market failures and oligopolies and monopsonies and all these other things, right? But the market's good at artificially scarce goods too. Sometimes artificially scarce goods are called club goods because the way that you can consume them is if you buy into the club, right? You pay some kind of fee in some way, right? You're being prevented from consuming the benefits unless you've contributed to the production. So we would consider it to be excludable. But we would also say that they're not rivalrous. So Netflix or any streaming service is a great example. Any streaming, right? Any streaming service is a great example of an artificially scarce good. We could say that we could make it excludable, right? You put a password on it unless you paid for it and so forth, right? This isn't to say that people don't try, right? And sometimes it's like, Dr. Gloucester, what about when I just steal the cheeseburger? Doesn't that make it not excludable? And I'm like, no, dude, that just means that you've stolen it, right? So we're setting outside the bounds here of like that you have people who are just thieves, right? That's a whole separate animal. Another example of an artificially scarce good, right, where you have excludability, but it's not really rivalrous, might be like a toll road. That's kind of a different type of example from, say, Netflix. It's excludable in the sense that we put up a gate, you pay your fee, you get on the toll road. And it's not really, in the sense, rivalrous. If I'm driving on the toll road, typically you can drive on the toll road as well. Obviously, all those things become rivalrous at a certain point, right? There's an interesting movement among movie tickets, right? Movie tickets have kind of moved from being artificially scarce goods to being private goods in a little bit of ways, depending on actually how they're assigned. So, for example, if you go to buy your movie ticket and it's just like general admission and it's like sit anywhere you want, then we would say that it's non-rivalrous in the sense that like I can sit in the movie theater and you can too. But if I'm buying a specific seat, right, like a seat, seat 12B or something, then the movie ticket is a private good. So it's kind of an interesting thing where we could move a good from one to the other just through slight tweaks to kind of how we're actually selling it. Reasonably, though, the market is great for excludable things. Now, let's talk about the two market failures, because that's actually what this lecture is about. Common resources and public goods. Common resources are ones that are rivalrous in consumption, where if I'm consuming it, you can't, or it prevents you from enjoying the benefits if I am. But I can't really easily prevent someone from consuming it. And the problem then is that people will overconsume it and then it's gone, right? So the central issue isn't that this overconsumption happens. It's actually that the overconsumption happens and that rivals out other people, right? So it's not an unlimited resource. There's a finite amount of it. And so we could say a common resource might be something like clean air. Clean air. It appears to be an infinite, right, resource, right? But you got to think about like something like, say, CO2. Holy smokes, the bowling balls above me. They're doing some kind of science experiment upstairs. I don't know. CO2 emissions or any kind of emissions, right? Emissions are an example where someone could use that clean air and it's rivalrous in the sense that like once I've polluted the clean air, it's no longer clean, but there's no way to exclude me from the benefit of or from kind of consuming it in that way, right? Like there isn't an easy way to stop a polluter from polluting the clean air in that sense, but it is rivalrous because once I've polluted it, it's no longer clean. Another one would be fish in the sea. Fish in the sea. And this is usually used as kind of the direct example of it, because it's like if I go out with my fishing trawler and I use my gigantic net and I net up all of the fish, they are rivalrous. Now you cannot fish them, but it's very, very challenging, we find in practice, to exclude fishing trawlers from doing those kind of things. Even if you ban the practices, right, you're kind of trying to do that. It's still really hard. And so the methods by which we try to solve these problems are actually challenging as well. They don't always work that well. But the problem here is that the rivalrousness, the idea that once it's gone, and the non-excludability mean that people overconsume it until it's totally depleted. And this is called the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the common resources. This phrase was coined in 1968, a time of acute concern for the environment. And actually, that's really what fuels the origins of this idea, is that it's really about how we will use up all of the environment if we don't actually make some changes. So how could we fix the tragedy of the commons? Well, we could make it excludable. We could make it excludable by assigning licenses or ownership. Now, it's a little hard to do that with things like clean air, but you could do it with fish in the sea, right? We could say assigning quotas, right, and saying, or you get a license to fish and you can only fish this much fish. That we could say you're allowed to fish in this area and you're allowed to fish in this area. So if we divide up kind of the area of where the fish are, the problem is the fish go from one area to another. So it's really hard to actually kind of make sure that someone isn't really overfishing in that sense. Another one that we can do, the tragedy of the commons, is to regulate, or ban consumption. And that's the heavy-handed, that's the big government solution, right? That's the big government one, is to literally come in, and that's more like quotas would be regulate. This is the small government solution. I'm going to kind of give you both because, reasonably speaking, it depends on the actual situation, right? It depends on what it is. Are we talking about fish in the sea or clean air? If it's clean air, it's going to be really hard to assign ownership of the air. But what you could do is you could create emissions permits, right? You could have a permitting system or a quota system of some kind. If it's really, really bad, like for example with certain CFCs, we just banned them, right? Chlorofluorocarbons are so damaging to the ozone layer that governments around the world, literally all the governments around the world, signed a treaty and said we're not going to use these products anymore because it is going to be so damaging. So you can go with the big government, ban the consumption of it. You can also go with small government and say you get to fish that area, you get to fish that area. Everybody goes their own way, right? Another second market failure is called the free rider problem. The free rider problem doesn't always emerge really with common resources, but it really emerges with public goods. Public goods are not rivalrous in the sense that if I'm consuming the benefits of it, you can too, and they're not excludable, which means that they can't prevent someone from enjoying the benefits who hasn't contributed to the production. So there are lots of public goods out there, but they don't usually, market doesn't do these. Market bad at both. Markets are bad at both in for both of these. And obviously for this one, the market leads to overconsumption. For this one, the problem is companies don't produce these because nobody pays for them. If there's not really an easy way to exclude the good, and it's especially if it's non-rivalrous, then we're not going to run out of it, non-rivalrousness. The problem is companies don't want to make it, right? They're not going to produce it because there's no value in it. The classic example of a public good that I think works really well is a lighthouse, right? There's no way for me to say, don't look at the lighthouse in the middle of the storm, right? When you're in your little boat and you're being buffeted by the waves. Oh no, help. And you look out and you see the lighthouse and I'm like, no, you can't look at the light because you didn't pay. That doesn't work, right? You're going to look at the light and you're going to avoid crashing into the ocean. So the other issue is it's non-rivalrous. That's not really the rival. That's not the issue, but it's really that I can't prevent you from looking at it. So all lighthouses are provided by the government. Right? Actually, that's what they do. And sometimes what we do is we produce little fees or taxes to pay for them. So we use taxes or fees to pay for production. So, for example, if in the lighthouse's case, you might have the local harbor master who would charge a fee to any boats that dock in the harbor, and part of that fee goes to offset the cost of the lighthouse. So it's kind of taking basically this public good and trying to produce it in a way using the government. Now, another thing that's a public good that I think is very interesting is I'm going to call it civic virtue, or voting, if you will, right? In a really direct sense, voting. Voting is something that the market doesn't produce because ultimately I can't prevent someone else from benefiting from the fact that people are virtuous and voting and participating in the political process. And some people are going to be like, okay, I'm good. And they're not going to waste any time researching candidates, researching issues, going out and actually voting, going through the trouble of doing it. They're going to look at it and go, I'm going to enjoy the benefits of democracy without actually contributing to its maintenance and upkeep. And there is a central issue, right? You want to talk about a major problem at the root of Republican forms of government is that people are selfish, and that those selfish people are going to basically ride for free on the hard work of all the other people who are learning about the candidates, learning about the ballots, who are going through the work of actually registering to vote and going to vote. And so we actually have a problem at root inside of republics, and it is that civic virtue, the notion of like encouraging people to participate in their government, is actually something that's not in their own selfish, rational interest. They shouldn't do that. As long as they feel like everybody else is going to do what they need to do, then they can essentially ignore it, right? The American non-voter and non-voters writ large are really just taking advantage of this central problem, right? And so what some countries have done is required the production of good, require the production of the good. That's hard to do, right, for some goods. we can do that. And in some countries, like for example, Australia, they require people to vote. And the reason why they require people to vote is because they're solving the free rider problem, right? They're saying, I'm not going to let people take advantage of the fact that everybody else who's working really hard and participating in democracy and doing what they're supposed to do, that those people are working, so I don't have to, right? I can just kind of take a back seat and let you all choose these things. Another example of a public good, the last one that I'm going to use, is national defense. And this is another one where I think it's pretty clear you use taxes to pay for the production of the good, because you're not really going to see the production of those kinds of goods and services by the market, right? And the reason why they wouldn't is this. If you pay your taxes and that supports the military, and the military ostensibly protects all of our property, right? That's the purpose of government, is to protect property. And so it's protecting my property. Well, if I don't pay any taxes and I don't want to contribute to national defense, right? And I'm just like, nah, I'm not feeling it, guys. I don't want to do that. I'm still getting the benefits. I'm still benefiting from you paying your taxes and contributing to national defense because my property is protected. National defense also, like fire protection, fire departments are another example of that, right? Like if you pay for the fire department and then I'm like, I don't want to, well, I still benefit because it's less likely for my house to burn down because they're going to come put the house fire out next door. Or, with national defense, I can't exclude somebody from benefiting from it. I can't be like, hey, Al Qaeda, kill this guy first because he didn't pay his taxes. It doesn't work that way. So typically we say in these types of goods and services, we use taxes or fees to pay for the production, or we just require the production of them in the cases of things like voting. So there's maybe an economic argument to actually requiring people to vote. All right, so hopefully this helped you understanding the two market failures of the free rider problem, the tragedy of the commons, and also a quick summary of market failures. I'll see you next time.